Hello, everyone. Thank you so much for tuning in to the Hen House at Home Fall Book Tour. I am Toby Harper, the Deputy Director at Red Hen Press.
And I'm Monica Fernandez, the Media Manager.
We're excited to bring you this event featuring our shorter fiction writers. But before we get to that, we wanted to say a very happy publication day to Susan Ludvigson's Wave If You Can See Me. This beautiful collection of poetry explores loss and grief through ethereal, dreamlike landscapes, where each stanza and verse packs a significant punch of emotion. It is a tearjerker for sure, but each poem leaves you stunned and thinking about it well into the next morning. It's a work of art. We're so honored to be able to share it with you, so please pick up a copy today. But today's event focuses on our three short prose writers. We will have Lara Ehrlich, author of Animal Wife, Reema Rajbanshi, author of Sugar Smoke Song, and Tracy Daugherty, author of High Skies. We'll hear each of them read from their recently released books and then launch into a fabulous conversation about their books, the craft of writing shorter fiction, and some tips and tricks about submitting manuscripts for awards or publication, all moderated by our very own Monica Fernandez. So to kick things off, we're going to start with Lara Ehrlich. Lara, please take it away.
Thank you so much, Toby and Monica, and thank you for having us. Tonight I'll be reading from my book, Animal Wife. There we go, which is a collection of short stories about girls and women and their transformation into wives, mothers, and monsters. So I will start with just a brief excerpt from the story called Desiree the Destroyer. Eve's doctor recommends she draw a map of her breasts to become familiar with their topography. Eve imagines such a map veined with blue-green rivers, the ridge of her breastbone, a mysterious world she never wants to visit. Desiree the Destroyer's breasts overflow her spandex jumpsuit, and she dusts them with glitter so they catch the cage lights. She knows how to make an impression. Her spiked knee pads leave puncture wounds in her competitor's thighs. Her mother sews her costumes with liberal use of sequins. Desiree the Destroyer designs her own capes. When Eve was growing up, her mother sewed her clothes from 10-cent pattern books. Their covers depicted girls in ruffled dresses. In middle school, the other kids teased Eve, but she couldn't tell her mother she wanted clothes from the mall. Eve is 30 and her mother still makes her clothes. At 30, Desiree the Destroyer still lives with her mother, who lures practice partners into the garage with milk and cookies. The pesticide sprayer from next door, the throat clearer from across the street, the drag racer from down the block. As the door slides shut behind them, they blink in confusion. Cookies crumble in their fists. Desiree the Destroyer strides down the stairs from the mudroom, her cape billowing, her décolletage glittering. They freeze in wonder before her. There was the creep who parked his van across from the elementary school. Desiree the Destroyer crushed his groin. There was the paperboy who lobbed the Sunday edition through her mother's sun porch window. Desiree the Destroyer planted her knee on his neck and made him weep for mercy. There was the Doberman that terrorized small children. Desiree the Destroyer tore out its throat. Eve is a champion of the English language. She arranges her office supplies parallel to the edges of the desk and does not initiate conversation with the other proofreader, Nancy, who shares her cubicle. Nancy's the type of woman Eve could easily become if she were less vigilant. Nancy signs her emails THX. She wears low-cut shirts that reveal her collarbones. She uses both drink tickets at the company holiday party. Nancy has an online dating profile. Still, Eve is eager to appear friendly. She knows everyone's birthday and favorite donut. She approaches office relationships with the same precision she devotes to tracking her time. Her boss has suggested she is perhaps too diligent, though he appreciates her attention to detail. When she tries to ease up, her attention to detail drags her back down into thoroughness. Eve fears she is a car with blown-out brakes sliding down a hill. No one is looking. She slips her fingers into her shirt. Desiree the Destroyer can crush a skull between her thighs. Sometimes she squeezes just enough to make a competitor pass out. Some men like that. Every Monday at 9, Eve watches cage fighting. She treats herself to low-cal popcorn and takes notes in a dedicated spiral-bound notebook. Desiree the Destroyer grips the chain link enclosure and throws her head back as the spectator's screams throb through her body. They love it, but she doesn't do it for them. She is enthralled to her desires. This is what makes her such a successful sexual partner. Desiree the Destroyer wears her cape to bed, and she is always on top. Thank you.
Thank you, Laura. That was terrific. High Skies is a novella set in West Texas in the late 1950s. And here, the narrator, looking back at the 1950s from the present day, recalls his childhood in the desert there. He begins by describing an old school friend of his named Stevie, and then he moves from that to giving an overview, really, of what the community was like in the 50s and what it was like growing up in West Texas. The first time I saw Stevie's crutches in the lunchroom in first grade, I wanted to run away from him. Naturally, the fact that he was different frightened me, and the crutches meant he had a disease. I didn't want to catch whatever afflicted his body. It took many weeks for me to feel comfortable around him, weeks of closeness. Teachers sat us together at lunch one day and the arrangement stuck, of talking to him, of learning we liked science and the same comic books. My mother had told me he suffered from arthritis. It wasn't a communicable disease, she said. Even as a child, I was struck by the implications of her wording. If you communicated, you got sick. On the other hand, sickness also spread from lack of communication, a circumstance our community soon endured. On September 4th, 1957, Texans would watch on television as National Guardsmen in the neighboring state of Arkansas, on orders from Governor Orville Faubus, blocked 9 Black students from entering Central High School in Little Rock, while a growing crowd chanted, "Go home." Texans weren't the only ones watching. Immediately, all over the world, the Soviet Union disseminated press releases mocking American rhetoric about freedom and equality in the face of such obvious racial discrimination. School segregation became a major Cold War issue, a weapon in the global conflict. Months earlier in the spring, at the time of the storms, our hardscrabble town had engaged in Cold War combat, and our schools played a role in the drama. Because of its proximity to Webb Air Force Base, Midland became awash in rumors in mid-April concerning a Soviet installation in the southern Ural Mountains. U.S. intelligence had gathered information about an incident there in the Chelyabinsk district. Stories of ugly purplish skies, rich farmland plowed under overnight, livestock slaughtered. The Soviet government offered no official statements and managed to successfully impose a news blackout. But some of the men stationed at Webb knew that Chelyabinsk was the home of the Mayak nuclear facility. In 1949, it had produced the Soviet Union's first atomic bomb. These men knew that in addition to the ruined farmland and murdered cattle, villagers downstream from Mayak were reporting dozens of cases of radiation sickness. These men, the important men who knew all this, they became a little too relaxed in the evenings while on R&R from Webb, a little too lubricated. They talked about Mayak. Word got around Big Spring. It made its way to Midland. One day at work, my father heard about Mayak from a colleague who'd got it from a friend of a friend who knew a colonel at Webb. There had been an accident, releasing radiation. It had happened because Soviet officials were putting enormous pressure on the facility to build more bombs. Clearly, the communists were gearing up for large-scale war. Midland, Texas, in 1957, was not the only mid-American town paranoid about communism and the possibility of a nuclear attack. Nor was it the only town with a conservative city council whose members prided themselves on patriotism. Men, for they were all men, who considered Senator Joseph R. McCarthy a role model. He had died that spring of alcohol-related causes. The senator's work of rooting out communist spies wherever they infected American institutions would not die with him, these men insisted. Midland, Texas was not the only place in 1957 whose city council wanted to send a patriotic message, to whom was not entirely clear, a warning about the escalating arms race. It was not the only place to pass an official ordinance forbidding visits from persons traveling to the United States on Soviet passports, as well as citizens from Eastern Bloc countries. Such ordinances went into effect that year on Long Island, in Northern California, and in most of the mid-sized towns along the east coast of Florida. Midland's councilmen cited the town's oil production, crucial to the nation's future energy needs, and its location near Webb Air Force Base as the primary reason to ban Soviets from traveling to the region. Who knew what military secrets they might try to steal? But it was also the case that in the wake of Brown v. Board of Education, these same places, towns like Midland, proudly making strong Cold War stances, were strenuously fighting federal efforts to integrate their public schools. Even before the events in Little Rock, Arkansas, it was national news that the Soviet Union regularly tried to embarrass the United States on the world stage by playing up racial strife in its cities. Even my father, who said he supported the Midland City Council's stand against communism, mused aloud one day, "Maybe they don't want the Ruskies here because they don't want them to see what it's like on the wrong side of the tracks." Thank you.
Thank you, Tracy, for that really rich excerpt. Hi, everybody. I'm Reema Rajbanshi, and I'll be reading from my book, Sugar Smoke Song. It is a linked collection of stories, semi-experimental, that really focus on girlhood, violence, and migration. I will be reading a section, they're sectioned off Sugar, Smoke, and Song, and I'll be reading from part of the middle section, Sugar. In the beginning, Yusuf would tell me stories of the back-ruining work digging trenches, quenching fires that had sprung up all over the county in a deepening drought. He would set me on his lap and say calmly, those chapped hands turning my face this way and that in the sun, "Where else would someone like you have met someone like me, Nirmali, except at a party? We're not that different. Never forget, you are not Black. You know what was the first word that came to me when I saw you? Unhinged." He shooed me off his leg and said scornfully as he yanked open the back screen door, "You're beautiful, Nirmali, but you're weird." "I could say the same of you," I shouted, but he would have closed the glass door so that I'd have to walk round and ring my own front bell. In the first month, I learned Yusuf knew a million things about the Shoah, about the poetry and protests after Nakba, though we'd argue about whether Indians were Arab or Asian. "I've seen the Middle East," he said one night, before a day-long TV series on Bob Marley's live concerts. "They have your color, your features, your food. The rest of my family gets mistaken for Korean or Filipino or Mexican," I said, thinking back to guessing games in the Bronx over some grocery register or before a subway map placard. "It's not that simple for us." But he turned away, clicking up the volume on the remote. "Whatever you do, don't make me eat any more couscous or watch any more genocide documentaries. I'm done." When midsummer heat gave way to late summer fires, I learned Yusuf could only talk about love in code. There was the night he came bearing Robin Williams' What Dreams May Come, a movie even sappier than a Bollywood flick. He lounged on the futon, holding me so tightly I couldn't breathe, while he paused on every painting heaven seen. Can you believe this kind of love? No, I can't. There was the night he came with Coming to America, Yusuf replaying the moment Eddie Murphy, discovering his chosen bride is in fact his American love, beams, his whole suited self glowing with this new meaning to marriage. "Isn't it funny?" Yusuf said, like he's gotten a Christmas present. Then there was the night he brought V for Vendetta and said, slipping the disc into my laptop, "It's a smarty pants movie." He warned me he might fall asleep halfway through, and when I said, "What's the point of watching alone?" he said he wasn't going anywhere, and curled against me as he snored. Then there was the night he came fragrant with beer, jittery in his buttercream leather jacket. "You're late," I said, rubbing my hand along the arms and tiptoeing for his lush lips. "I love this jacket." "It's from Tariq. He walked off to my bedroom. That guy loves me like a brother." He lay halfway on the bed, an open Corona bottle in hand, his legs planted on the gray carpet. I sat near him, my hands rising, falling on his chest, and he said he'd been to see his folks. My brother said, "Yo, Yusuf, what's going on? You still seeing that nice Indian girl?" "They don't remember my name?" "I'm almost 30. I'm a grown man with no time to waste. Do you understand what I'm saying?" "You've told me this." "I spent 2 years with a woman who hid me from her folks, who was going on blind dates while we were still living together." I lay my hands on my lap and wondered what burned more, Yusuf hung up on Zulekha, Yusuf withstanding more for her than he would for me, myself the one nursing his wounds. "I welcome you into my home. I'm still waiting for you to get checked. I've told my folks about you." I didn't mention Yusuf sweating beside me that afternoon. "How many of these have you done?" Okay, he said, sandwiching my hands between his. "I'm just talking aloud is all." "Which sounds untrue," I wanted to shout, to someone who teaches singing and reading. But I fibbed too. "Whatever, it's up to you." Still holding my hands, he looked away, said nothing at all. Years later, when I'm counting the red flags on the one Indian man I've ever dated, a toothy journalist who approached by asking why everyone knew about Syria but not about Kashmir, who it turned out was still pining over his Ethiopian ex on the nights he stewed red lentils alone, I'll wonder about triangles, how old they are, what they leave out, why two sides always, even minutely, overshadow the third. It's no different on my August visit home, hoping to trade a blistering sky for a little childhood rain. Ma and Dita shuffle in their kitchen like worn mahouts, offering pitas, tangy fish, curry goat to a mad elephant. This no-sound ritual, even with Uncle and Auntie there, means licking my knuckles and listening to love tonics from Assam, Mumbai, the islands. Zulekha tried to seduce Yusuf, Auntie says, though she was married to another man. Christians cheat too, Dita says, but Auntie doesn't flinch. When Yusuf scorned her, she had him jailed, she says. Later, Yusuf, free and rich, finds Zulekha, an old widow, on the street, and because she still loves him, he marries her. Romantic, Uncle says, but a bit fairy tale-ish, no? A fantasy, Ma laughs. Men want dogs. So do women, Auntie says. That's why I tell our girls, friendship first. What do I listen to but Yusuf's pause when I tell him I miss him? Right at midnight, car alarms blaring down empty streets, teens jeering bittersweet nothings from stoops. Nirmali, you can't buy family in the store. I start to snort why, but he ends, I'll call you tomorrow. He doesn't, and I'm left stringing words for 10 nights like nonsense ads on train rides to and from the city. Dios Cristo, seduce scorn, only when free and rich, knuckle loved, cheat married, fairy tale darkly, bendiga salva, tomorrow love, tomorrow, tomorrow, tomorrow. Thank you.
All right. Thank you guys so much. I'm so happy to be here and converse with you all. For those of you who don't know, I work at Red Hen. I work in the media and marketing department. So I've worked with Lara, Reema, and Tracy in advance of their publication of their books. But what a lot of people don't know is that I am also a writer. And I like to write kind of short fiction as well. So it's really pretty apropos that I'm here. I have some questions of my own, but if anybody out there in the audience has questions about the craft of writing short fiction or about submitting your manuscripts for awards or anything like that, feel free to comment and we will we'll address them. Before I get started on my questions, I know that you guys have questions for each other. So do you guys want to take that away? Get that started.
If I may, I have a question for both Reema and Lara. I was struck that in both of your collections, myths and fairy tales and ancient stories are very prevalent. And I'm wondering if you could each talk about why you're drawn to such material. And in terms of craft, do you think that myths and traditional tales that are passed on from generation to generation can serve as a kind of shorthand, immediately resonating with readers when you're writing short fiction?
That's a great question, Tracy. Thank you so much. And thank you both for your readings. They were beautiful and very poetic. So yeah, my collection is very much inspired by fairy tales and mythology. And I've been thinking a lot about why that is and what particularly draws me to that area. And for me, I think it's the transformation aspect. So Animal Wife is full of stories about girls and women transforming, both fantastically and physically in a more realistic sense. And so for me, the idea of transformation through fairy tales, the sense of becoming an other, whether it's an animal or a monster, or taking on the costume of a different body, is a way to access the inner lives of characters by what they choose to cloak themselves in. And often that sense of transformation can reveal your most human weaknesses, I think. That, for example, in one of the stories, it's about a woman who dons a mechanical deer costume, and the costume is so uncomfortable against her skin that it makes her very aware of her own humanity, her own human skin, and reinforces the humanity she's trying to leave behind. So that was the aspect specifically of fairy tales that resonated with me, was that sense of transformation and costuming. And I'll turn it over to Reema. Tracy posed the same question to you, and we just saw in the excerpt that you read that there was reference to fairy tales.
Yeah, thanks so much, Lara and Tracy, also for your really moving readings. Just really so beautifully read. Yeah, I definitely turn to, I mean, my story collection moves between genres. So, I think fables and fairy tales are part of that. But I think one of the reasons, similar to what Laura's saying, is I think there's something very accessible about that as a genre. So I think sometimes when I'm writing a story where I feel like it might be hard for the reader to get a foothold in it because of the experimentalism, or perhaps because I'm also moving between a lot of cultural terrains, because the book is a lot about migration and immigrant communities, that fables can be a kind of more, sort of open access space for a reader to enter in and understand, perhaps emotionally or in terms of the ideas of the story, what's going on, right? And I think also because my collection, I think this is very resonant with a lot of your book, Lara, is thinking through girlhood, right?
Mm-hmm.
And for me, I think there are so many, scripts we get, whether they're fables or fairy tales or just larger cultural scripts from, the multiple cultures I grew up moving between and that I write about. And so for me, part of what the book is thinking through is like these inherited narratives, which come often through fairy tales and fables, right? And because it's a kind of coming of age collection, it's also about the ways in which these young women sort of choose the parts that serve them and then discard the other parts, what they choose to reject, right? And I think Mufaro's Beautiful Daughter, which is the title of one of the stories, it's a play on the South African fair, the Joseph story, Mufaro's Beautiful Daughters with plural, and that's where the young girl narrator, she's kind of thinking through which of the sister characters she actually would prefer to be like.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think you're so right to talk about how we ascribe fairy tales to girlhood and womanhood, and what parts of them we are formed by, even if we recognize that they might be damaging, and then how we can turn them to our own advantage as we grow up, and we can use them in some ways to empower ourselves. Tracy, now your book is more grounded in reality, as we saw from your reading, and through layers of history, both personal history and sort of grander scale history. Could you talk about the layering of history in your book? Similar to the question that you posed to us, how do you use it both in narrative and in shorthand?
I'm fascinated by what Reema just said about all the different scripts that people are handed when they're children, girls and women, particularly in the cases of the stories you're writing. But that's something that interests me as well. I think the way that public life and public narratives shape our private lives has always fascinated me. And that's what's very much at play in this novella. It does talk about large public events and historical events, but I did not want to write facts and dates and history. I was trying to write a personal witness, which I think fiction is particularly suited to. And it is that that taking of the public and putting it in the form of a personal witness that fascinates me. It's like Bruegel's great painting Icarus, where the great disaster, the man falling from the sky, is in the background. The big public story is in the background, but in the forefront, we see people going about their trivial days, their what Auden called the doggy life, just life goes on. And in fiction, you can kind of shift that focus and put the big events in the background and make them small, but with the reader's knowledge that they are affecting everything that's happening. Like they're sending their resonance through every event. But the events in the foreground are the daily, ordinary things, and that's fascinating to me.
I guess I would just add on to Lara's question, because that was also something I noticed and appreciated very much about your novella, Tracy. Just maybe a craft question a little bit about how you struck that balance between talking about the big historical backdrop and then how your story remained anchored in not just the domestic, but I think something that we all did, which was to navigate and move through these cultural narratives in the location of childhood. That takes up a lot of the space perspective of our stories.
Right. I'm gonna date myself here, which you can see from my gray hair. When 400 years ago, when I started writing, every teacher told students then, in writing fiction, you should show rather than tell, because a droning, discursive voice is generally boring, and it's much better to put everything in the form of drama and scene and detail. But as with any good piece of advice, if you stick only to that, you really limit yourself rather than improve yourself as a writer. And as I've gotten older, I have been more drawn to voice-driven fiction because I've come to think we all do have things to tell as well as to show. And a voice need not be boring if you make it interesting. And for me, as I think it's true anytime an aging person looks back, that voice becomes interesting when you connect to your very personal, intimate memories from childhood. And so voice-driven fiction about childhood, as familiar as such narratives are, I think nevertheless has endless possibilities. And I think that's really how that novella got grounded.
Yeah, I think we'll have a lot to say about childhood. I see a question in the comment section, though. Maybe we should take an audience question before we continue with our questions.
Yeah, actually, Lara, I was just going to interject and say and bring that question up. So thanks for segueing into that. So we got an audience question from Edward from LinkedIn, of all places. He asks, speaking of characters, how do you go about writing them? I've often thought that we need to write people, not characters. So how do you get centered around these fictitious people you create? How do you avoid distraction and keep them real? So who wants to start that? How about we start with you, Lara?
Sure. So I think a good example that I'll use to answer that question is, again, the woman who builds the deer suit, because she was the most difficult character, probably, of all of the characters to write, in that to write her, and she is a fictional character, of course. To write her, I really had to get both into her human body, and then her human body within a mechanical body. So there were two layers of body, physical body, and then also get into her mental and emotional space. And to do that, I actually did some research, and that's not something I did for all of the characters. It was something specific to this one, where I talked to scientists in academia, specifically a woman at MIT who's a biomechanist. I can never remember how to pronounce that. About what her challenges were in that field and what her disappointments were and what the career trajectory is for a woman in the sciences and higher education, to instill that character with a sense of realism, and to build out her challenges in her career to offset against her challenges in her personal life. And in her personal life, she's had to put her family on hold and her relationships on hold due to her career. So there's a real butting of heads against those two things. And I'd be interested to hear from Reema specifically as well, on this point, that I found that when building characters, specifically those that cross genres and do unrealistic things, and often fantastical things, that the more grounded I can make them in realism, the more believable then the fantastical becomes. So the more realistic detail I could build into that character of Diana, then the more realistic her journey becomes when she puts on this very unrealistic mechanical deer suit and goes off into the forest to live as a deer. So I'm going to turn it over to Reema to answer that same question.
Okay, thanks, Lara. Yeah, I think a lot of what you described, especially in terms of talking about the body, which I think is something I read across all of our texts, was coming up as part of the theme, but also possibly writing process is important to my process for imagining and then getting a feel of the character. So I do write a lot out of the body, partly just to, because I believe story lives in the body, and to get a sense of what kind of stories this character might be carrying with them, right? Especially because I am talking about migration. So I think about kind of the stories these characters are carrying that might have to do with maybe as part of drafting the character, the bio sketch, the sort of cultural narratives they bring, and then what's marked on the body. I think that's also just part of writing a book that for me, I wanted it to, to write it in a way that felt very engaged with like feminist discourses around the body and truth lying in the body and history and trauma being in the body. And so that's a really important part of my process for imagining character. And, just thinking about, for example, the last story, which is one of the newest stories in my collection, One Tiny Thing, it's about a lot of things. It's about labor, the way we have to navigate labor in our lives, but it's also about a friendship between two women who are dealing with trauma they carry on their body that shows up in chronic illness or disability. And so that to me was an important part of, kind of the spoken or unspoken resonances between them, and also flashing up the histories, their life stories, right? So I think those are some of the things I think about. And I think ultimately, and I think I'll pass this question on to Tracy. I think it is about striking this balance, I think, in the process, especially when you make these leaps, in my case, to the experimental or the fantastical. Like in my most experimental story, BX Blues, I knew I was moving into a lot of second person story, really talking about kind of inherited narratives from, Hinduism, right? So those kinds of narratives. And so I wanted to, again, just ground back in the body. And that was partly why I moved across genres, trying to strike that balance in that way.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think picking up on that point, not only body, but motion and activity and what people do really is a nice key to their character very often. And I think it's useful to think about how story or narrative can grow out of character when you're writing fiction. I can give an example, not from High Skies, but from an earlier piece that I worked on. I've always loved maps And so I wanted to write about a map maker, a character who was a map maker. And I don't really know anything about making maps or the technical side of it. But as a fiction writer, what interested me is, what does a map maker do? A map maker is someone who wants to find everything and put it in its proper place. So a very kind of organized, maybe a kind of tight person was the kind of character I began to imagine just based on map making. An organized person who does not like to get lost.
Mm-hmm.
So where does a story come from out of a character like that? I mean, the obvious thing to do, since the story is about conflict, is to get that character lost. How do you get that character lost? In every possible way, physically, literally, also in his personal life, his emotional life. Just get that character lost every way possible. And then you have both character and story working in concert. And so I think that's kind of formulaic, but it's not a bad way to think about character.
Mm-hmm.
It's a good craft point too. Advice.
Yeah, definitely. As far as craft goes, that will segue. So Lara and Reema, your collections with Red Hen Press are both debut collections. So this is your first published book. Are you guys working on anything longer, like a novel type fiction, or are short stories kind of like where you're at right now?
Yeah, I'm working on a novel. That's my next project. I have always been interested in both novels and very short fiction, both short stories in the traditional sense of 5,000-6,000 words, but then also flash fiction of a few pages, a few paragraphs, even a couple sentences. And I think each of them, both short fiction and longer fiction, have such fascinating opportunities and challenges. And it's interesting to shuffle between the two types of projects and see where those are. And something I love about short fiction is the compression, both in space and time, but also of language, that you can really focus on each word and spend the time to ensure that each sentence or that each word within a sentence is necessary and in the right place, and then that each sentence works against the others, and then each paragraph. So you can really spend the time doing that in a way that like a poet might do, to ensure that it really packs a powerful punch. A novel, it's a little more challenging to do that. And I'm sure that Reema and Tracy would have similar things to say about writing long and short fiction. But the short answer is yes, I am working on a novel now. I'll turn it over to Tracy maybe next, since you shuffle between those lengths. You've written a novella that we're talking about now, but you've also written shorter fiction.
Mm-hmm. Well, in recent years, I've been writing big, fat nonfiction books, specifically biographies. But I think paradoxically, writing those biographies led me to shorter fiction because, again, the biographies tended to be more voice-driven than my previous fiction. And I got comfortable with voice, and that led me into shorter fiction, because the voice-driven fiction, as you say, is amenable to compression. And that's become more important to me as I've gotten older. Time feels short, and there's a sense of urgency, and I want to say what I have to say while I can, and get as much of it out as I can. And so, being clean and quick and compressed and getting in and getting out has become very important to me. So the novella really has become my favorite form these days. I have about 7 of them sitting on my floor because I don't know what to do with them, because it's a problematic length for most publishers. So thank you, Ray, for being amenable to it.
Tracy, can I ask you on that point about novellas? And since it is this often strange zone between a short story and a novel, talk about the choice to make a story a novella, so not a longer piece or a short story. What is it about your book that begged to be a novella versus one or the other of those forms?
Again, I think it goes back to my thinking about, say, Bruegel's painting, where the big event is in the background and the small events are in the foreground. I have become very enamored of that that way of constructing a narrative, where we know what we're talking about, but we don't really talk about it directly, and yet it affects everything else that happens. And to me, that is just a fascinating perspective in any kind of writing. And I think that's what makes it a novella rather than a short story. A short story for me tends to be, very keenly focused on a moment, an instant, a turning point in a character's life, a ring shot rather than an extended solo. And so I think the novella gives you that slightly bigger perspective while still remaining compressed. I don't know if that quite answers the question, but that's...
Yeah, no, that's great. Thank you.
Yeah. I want to go back to our discussion about character. I thought up this question and then I forgot it. So then I asked another, but now I remembered it. When you guys are kind of writing your characters, at least for me, I have a very specific vision for my main characters, but I have a real problem with the secondary characters and having them kind of be one-dimensional or only used as tools to kind of facilitate the main character's journey. But I really don't want to do that. I really want to make sure that these secondary characters have lives of their own. So do you guys encounter that problem? And if you do, how do you get out of it?
Reema, do you want to answer first? I think you were next in the in line here.
Yeah, no, I think I'll answer Monica's question, then just kind of loop back to that last little strand there. Yeah, no, I mean, for me, my process is very organic. And so, I think maybe you got the sense from that when I was speaking to, Lara's question, earlier question about, striking that balance. And so, I just kind of follow characters as they emerge. I tend to have a pretty clear idea at the outset of, a character or two that will be the central protagonist, especially in the short story form. Like I don't tend to kind of overpopulate the short story. I don't think as a form it's ready for that. But then, I'll just kind of feel around for where maybe a surprise character emerges in a scene that doesn't want to go away, right? So I think that kind of way of describing the process is also to say I do trust that the characters in the story takes on a life of its own. And then I think if I feel like it's really taking the story for a real left turn or becoming too much longer, then I have a series of avenues to explore, right? Which could be maybe it's actually suited for a slightly longer form, like maybe a novella. I think probably a few of us have like novellas tucked away in our drawers or drafts of them. Or I think about, kind of just, unfortunately, as part of the revision process, ruthlessly cutting out, right? So I tend to be somebody who for the short story form at least just tends to focus unless I think there's a character who's really mesmerizing, or sometimes, and this kind of takes me back, I think, a little bit to the audience question about character that, came to my mind later, and I think resonates a little bit with the points about voice that's coming up. For me, I'm interested in characters and voices that are, talking about like emotions that we tend to put aside or uncomfortable with, like rage and grief and shame. And so I think if I see a side character popping up who is articulating that to me can mean that this is the opening in which the story wants to explore that. And that's actually, for me, I feel like a good nerve in the story often. I mean, to me, I'm interested in stories like that, and I'm interested in characters like that.
Fantastic. We have another question from Facebook. Moa Zam, I'm sorry if I butchered your name. How important do you think, as an American writer, is it to incorporate U.S. foreign policy in your writing as something that affects our domestic politics and values? So I guess this kind of speaks to like if that's something in your story that feels like it needs to be addressed, or if it's an organic kind of thing, or do you feel the need to kind of write stories like that address these issues?
I think one thing that's emerging from the conversation we're having here is that for most writers, I suspect, I mean, I hate to speak so broadly, but Even writers as different as the three of us are, doing different kinds of things with narrative, nevertheless, it seems that we are all kind of in agreement that that story begins with some sense of character, with some sense of how that character is affecting the narrative or putting the narrative in motion, rather than a big idea like I want to write about foreign policy or I want to write about politics. I think some writers, of course, begin there, but most fiction writers that I've encountered, and it sounds like Reema and Lara are in agreement with this, tend not to start with an idea, but with an intuition, maybe a piece of language, maybe a structure, a form, character, narrative. So I think it feels too intimidating in a way to begin with. All right, I'm going to write about foreign policy. However, as I say, one thing that interests me as a writer is how the public does shape the private. So in that sense, being as aware of the world and the global implications and foreign policy and so on, can be important and can be useful, but it's probably not where I would choose to begin as a writer.
Yeah, I think I'll just jump in there. Also, since I really appreciate Muazzam's question. So Muazzam, thank you for posing that question. I think I agree partially with Tracy. And I think I would kind of circle back to what I was saying earlier, that the process for me is just organic. But what that also means for me is that it's really unthinkable for me to not be writing about kind of the way the political has shaped the personal for me, right? Like the stories are about the personal, but for me, I came of age as a person, after 9/11 in New York City, where I grew up, the beginning of the War on Terror, and so that really profoundly shaped my experience of moving in the body that I moved through in this country, in a country I was born in, and so for me, I think just even trying to write characters that have whose biographies and interior emotional lives have some resemblance to the experiences I had or friends of mine had in this formative moment for me personally. I can't imagine writing the personal without that inflecting it in that way. And so I think I would say organically it enters in because I pay attention to those things. I hope that writers are always doing that, right? We live in the world, right? And our lives are shaped by the broader world and the bigger historical backdrop, I think, which shows up in all of our books. But for me in particular, I think that's something that does flash up as affecting the domestic, the way that it is written in my book.
Yeah, I'm really fascinated to hear you both talking on this subject, and how politics and the big picture and these big historical moments have shaped the interior lives of your characters as they move through their worlds. It's not something that I'm consciously thinking about, or that I was consciously thinking about when writing the stories in Animal Wife, and I think your word domestic is really helpful to me when talking about the difference between your stories and maybe the ones that I've written in Animal Wife that are very much smaller in scale, I think. They are very internal. They're about women and women's lives and bodies, in some cases divorced from history and from the big picture, but yet informed by our mythology surrounding girlhood and womanhood and our bodies. So I guess what I'm trying to say is that I feel as though there's often pressure on writers, as Tracy said, to write about big things, about war and trauma and tragedy. But there's just as much value in writing about small things, about motherhood, about career challenges, about things that are very personal, and in some cases that word again, domestic, which are just as important to us in our daily lives as the big historical events that have shaped our the world in which we live. So yeah, I think there's value to both the big picture and the very, very small picture.
Yeah, we have another question from the audience, but I wanted to, before we wrap up, I wanted to get to talking about submissions. So all three of you guys are actually Red Hen Press award winners, which is pretty awesome. So Reema won our Women's Prose Award, Lara won our Fiction Award, and Tracy won our Novella Award. So I wanted to ask what that submission process was like for you. Kind of, were you guys submitting these manuscripts exclusively for awards, or did you see your award and kind of just were like, why not? So what do you guys have to say? Let's start with Tracy.
I tend not to submit manuscripts to awards because, again, I'm 400 years old, and I tend to think that award categories are often rightly geared toward helping younger writers and people at the beginnings of their career. And I'm at the opposite end of that spectrum. So I tend to stay away from it. But as I mentioned earlier, novellas are very difficult to publish because of their length, and many publishers stay away from them. So when I saw that Red Hen was opening itself up to taking novella submissions, it was less the award that attracted me than simply a fine press like Red Hen was open to novellas. So that's really why I took the chance. And again, I'm very grateful that Red Hen was open to it.
Gotcha. Reema, how about you?
Well, this is my first book, and it's a linked story collection. So, I assumed it was going to be a hard sell. The book was unagented. So this seemed to me like one of the ways I saw peers, being able to find a good publisher for a book like this. And, I was definitely submitting it to contests for presses that I admired, and, for judges whose writings I admired. And, I was and am a big fan of Lydia Yuknovich's work. And so that was definitely one reason that I submitted. And so I was, trying to kind of look around for sort of strategies for a, first book that was stories, but also for presses and contests that seemed like a good fit for my aesthetic and my subject.
Lara?
Yeah, very much the same story as Reema's. Short story collections are notoriously challenging to sell. But to any listeners out there who write short stories, here are 2 case studies for success. So if that's what you write, I think you should keep writing it. I mean, you'll hear from agents often, and even other editors, write a novel, always have your novel in hand, but it's not, I just think that is very short-sighted and limiting. So I really appreciate that Red Hen publishes short story collections and takes a chance on debut authors, and opens the field through contests. And that was, like Reema said, also why I submitted my collection to Red Hen, because of the reputation of the press and its risk-taking. So hopefully it's not too much of a risk to actually publish short story collections, because they're wonderful. Short story, I mean, who doesn't love reading short stories? So
Maybe that's a segue to a question for Monica. I mean, from the publisher's point of view, are you seeing short stories in shorter forms more frequently, and are you more and more interested in such things from the publisher's point of view?
Yeah, we do consider a lot of short story collections for acquisition. So we get so many submissions coming through our desks. Kate, our managing editor, is the one that looks through them all, and she kind of picks through and tries to find the ones that have the right aesthetic for the press, and then she forwards them on to the rest of the staff, where we get a chance to kind of read and give our own opinions as well. So yeah, quite a few short story collections have come our way. Personally, I love short story collections. A short story collection, actually, when I started working at Red Hen, was the first like Red Hen book that I read when I was working here, which is Everyone Wants to Be Ambassador to France by Brian Hurt. And kind of speaking on a personal note, I was stuck in my writing career, and I was just like I was floundering with a novel that I was trying to work on. And then I read this collection and it just inspired me to start writing short stories instead. More so because I really wanted to get out of that headspace of like, I'm failing at this, like I can't write. And it allowed me to kind of like explore different stories in a much shorter span of time. And with those moments, the moments that short stories kind of focus on, as opposed to like the whole arc of a novel. And so I really appreciate kind of short story collections, and I love how they are, you know, they're bite-sized, but I also love the idea of linked short story collections, which is something that I'm probably going to be leaning towards, because I love kind of having a set of characters or like a setting or something, but kind of moving them from moment to moment, as opposed to like trying to bridge that gap between like A and B, and it feels kind of trudging and stuff like that. So, yeah. I think publishers in general are definitely looking for short story collections if you find the right one. So definitely consider Red Hen, because we do publish short story collections. But if we're not the right fit for you, then bunches and bunches of indie presses, I'm sure, are still considering them. So,
I just want to jump in really quickly, and I think kind of echo something that Lara said too, which is, you know, I think if you love the short story form or shorter fiction forms, and that is the mode through which whatever story it is you feel compelled to tell is, you know, coming out onto the page, then I think it's worthwhile to pursue that, regardless of what maybe the sort of demands or the anxieties of the market are. You know, and I know that for me personally, and, you know, by no means, you know, should I be like a paradigm of any sort for like, you know, kind of putting a book out there into the market. But, you know, I think because I do write organically and I'm semi-experimental, you know, I think that was just the form that was right for the particular stories I felt like at the time I needed to tell. And I am glad that I focused on that instead.
Yeah, that's such a great point. I think we have time for one more question. So I'm going to pull in Michael's question from Facebook. Have you ever had a character explode in the story and kind of continue to grow and take over everything? And if so, how do you shape other characters how do you kind of manage that so that other characters have a chance to evolve as well? Or do you kind of just like go with the flow and trust that the main character, whichever character is taking up your mind, do you trust that they're going to lead you where it needs to go?
I always think in writing a first draft that exploding is great, and just following where the story is going to take you. You know, I'm somebody who writes very inefficiently, though, so I just write volumes and volumes and see what comes out of it. And sometimes that's a character who ends up not working in a story, and then they need to be struck out or minimized. And sometimes a character who you didn't think was a major player becomes a major player, and that's for good reason. And the story should be about that person instead, or that character has a role to play in helping the protagonist along the path of their stories. So I just hesitate to do too much self-editing when writing that first draft or even second draft until I know what the story is. And then once I've figured out what it is and who the characters are and who's important, then it becomes a matter of, as Michael says here, shaping the character so that the other characters have a chance to evolve. I think that's something that happens in revision. But yes, I've definitely had that happen where a character takes over, and sometimes it's absolutely the right path, and sometimes it's a dead end, but maybe that character becomes worthwhile in a different story. You can just shift them over and make them the star of their own short story.
Tracy, how about you?
Yeah.
I know that you've written kind of like longer novels as well. So I guess this is kind of across your novella and your novels.
Mm-hmm. I think that Robert Frost, the poet, once said, no surprises for the writer, no surprises for the reader.
That's right.
And I think that's a great rule of thumb, that, of course, you always have to be open to surprise. And if a narrative takes a different turn than you expected, or a character behaves differently than you expected, you have to follow that. I don't tend to think of it as characters exploding on me, though. It's, in my case, it's more the case that I tend to fall in love with a character I didn't intend to fall in love with.
Mhm.
Those secondary characters that you were talking about, Monica, sometimes they sneak up from behind you, and you weren't really expecting to give them so much time, but you start to fall in love with that character, and you have to go with that. And as Laura said, revision is where you balance everything out. You just have to write draft after draft after draft until everything is balanced. But the great thing about revision is you get a chance to be much better than yourself. You know, you write the first draft, then a second you comes along sometime later and writes the second draft. A third person, a third version of you comes along. So you get to be several different editors and several different people over time, and that makes you better than you were. So that's the great thing about revision.
Yeah.
I'll just to answer, thank you, Michael, for that question. Just to echo also what Lara and Tracy said, you know, in terms of it being a good thing when a character surprises you or when the story surprises you with some left turns. I think sometimes when I feel like a character is taking over maybe too much away from a central protagonist I had, I might do also what, you know, Lara said she does with revision, is kind of shift the character, nudge the character to another story. But I revise a lot. I write many drafts, so I also just trust the revision process, and that, you know, all the characters that are meant to be in the story will evolve on their own timeline, right? So I think some characters evolve earlier and become very full in an early draft of the story, and others, you know, kind of blossom later on.
All right. Well, this has been amazing. We didn't get to all of my questions. I'm sure we didn't get to all of your questions, but that is the sign of an amazing event. So thank you guys so much for your time. It was such a great honor to kind of talk to you guys, shoot the, you know, talk about the business of writing, and kind of just explore from a writer's perspective. Which I generally don't really get to do in my job. So I really appreciate kind of you guys taking the time to chat with me about that and chat with the audience and everybody who's viewing. Thank you guys so much for submitting your questions. And yeah, so thank you guys so much. This has been amazing.
Thank you.
Thank you.
It was wonderful talking to everybody.
Thank you.
Yeah, thank you all so much for joining us. This was a great event. I've been really enjoying watching this behind the scenes. And Reema, Lara, Tracy, thank you so much, and we'll see you soon.
Okay, bye.
Bye.
Bye. All right. Back to us. All right, Monica, nicely done. This was fantastic. That was we haven't done many craft events, and that was pretty fabulous. Also,
Yeah.
nice to be able to focus on shorter stories, which is actually similar to what we're going to get to do next week, which is to only speak with poets. Next time, we're going to get to hear from the authors of these incredible books, the one that we just said pub today, Susan Ludvigson's Wave If You Can See Me, as well as both of these. I'm going to have to cover my face for a second. But Suitor and the Horse Who Bears Me Away. Look at that. Look at that color matching. So nice. So we're going to hear from all this poetry next week, and then the week after that, we're going to have a special Boreal only event, and that means only our Alaskan authors from our Boreal imprint. So keep on tuning in every week. I'm very happy to be here, happy to see you, and see you next time.
Yeah, thanks. Bye.